All right, so I'm going to be talking about setting today, and I'll be giving a few examples, and these are going to be related to, let's actually take a look at some of the labs that this will be related to. So I'm going to go over to the skill tree, and these are most closely going to be related to some of our art labs. So after character animation, there are a few things you can work on, including the tile sets and platforms, and those are, how you build out the scenery and platforms and where you walk and stuff like that. And then there's also a couple more aspects of our sort of like game world, things that we don't interact with that are down here. So the scenery are just elements in the scene that aren't interactive. And then we're also going to look at how to add backgrounds. There's different ways to do this. We're going to specifically look at adding a parallax background. So those are the labs that this kind of relates to. But game setting, kind of depends on what type of game you're making, and there's different things to consider. So this is more kind of like an overview of what to think about in terms of designing the elements in your scene. So we started with our character, and now we want to start adding some stuff around the character. We haven't really learned how to program that stuff yet. So we're just going to start with some things that we don't really have to program, some non-interactive things. And so those are the things that we typically kind of go into our setting. Oops, I'm going to turn on my slides view. And so I like to find inspiration in different types of kind of like built worlds. Like you can see this kind of like cool little aquarium. You can almost see, as like a little game with different levels where there's these different orbs that have like these slightly different colors and different themes going on, but they're all connected. So you can imagine the fish kind of going through all these different levels in their little world and kind of mapping that space or thinking about how that space fits together. So that's I find that useful for inspiration, just thinking about space design, colors, like all these different things that go into designing a space and helping our character move through that space. One thing that we want to disambiguate a little bit is the idea of the game setting versus the world building. So these things are related to each other. We use elements of the setting to tell the player things about the world that we're in, but the world building can involve things that we don't see in the game. So the world building is kind of like the fictional world that our game is set in, and what components may or may not exist in that world. Things like, things that we can see, but also things like physics, like gravity and stuff like that. The setting is things that we can really see, things that we put into the game world that tell us things about our fictional universe. So this didn't fit on here, but that's basically what I said. So let's keep going. So as I mentioned, your game's fictional world may be much larger in scope than what the player actually sees. You can imply that with different things, like you could have, a very dense forest that you can't get to the end of. So you could imply there's a bigger world that you don't have access to by using the scenic elements. The setting is used to reveal that world to the player. So you might not be able to access or see every single part of the fictional world, the sort of like universe that makes up the game, but the setting is how we reveal the components of that world to the player. And so we need enough detail for the user to understand the basic premise and logic of the world. So, as I mentioned, things like physics are really important. So if you're on a world that's sort of like Earth, you're going to have gravity. And you're going to have a sky and trees and buildings and things like that. But if you're in a more fantasy world, like if you're underwater or in space or, in a place that doesn't exist at all, you would need to use the setting to communicate those components to the player. And that'll help them sort of frame their idea of how they're going to interact with this world, if they can fly or if they can, live underwater, different things like that. Game setting is also a little bit different from level design. We'll go in more depth in level design once we start to add more components to our games. The game setting is, again, it's just the things that we can see, and it's usually not the things we interact with, although those things are, part of the setting, obviously. But the backgrounds and the other scenic elements that they're just kind of there to set the scene. They don't really, they're involved in level design, but level design is the, designing of the progress of the level with the game mechanics and everything else like that. So again, setting and level design are related, but different concepts. So a few different types of game worlds. So this is something that we want to think about, and you can change this. You can make modifications to your game. Nothing is set in stone. But it's helpful to think about the setting of the game and then choose what can happen in that game, what kind of things you're going to put into it. So we can think of a few different types of worlds and then what kinds of things would go in those worlds. So let's look at a few different setting types, and then let's see if we can think of some examples of games that take place in these settings and what we might see in them. So let's start with fantasy. So does anybody have examples of a fantasy type game and what you might see in a fantasy type game?
Skyrim, and I guess like dragons and like magic and stuff.
Yeah,
Elves,
right.
orcs.
Other
That's a good
examples?
thing.
Monsters?
Okay. What are some other games that have a fantasy setting?
For example, like Genshin Impact, you have fire, water, earth, that kind of thing. You use elements to trigger something, and then suddenly you have some power.
Right. So kind of like magic.
And also sometimes maybe you can to do something and anti-gravity, so like alien or yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good one that because it overlaps a little bit in a second, and we'll see that all these different kind of settings have certain types of overlaps. But yeah, those are really good examples. The main thing that sort of makes fantasy is that it involves things that don't exist in the real world. So things like magic, things like the orcs or monsters or demons, things like that. Things that are not part of what we consider the real world. Let me check the chat. Witcher, yeah, is another good example of a fantasy game. So let's keep going. So we have a few other types of settings. Perspective world. Okay, something about the character's perspective is changed. So this is kind of a specific game type or setting type, but you guys might be able to think of some examples of this. Do you guys have any? I'll give the classic example of this and then a more modern example of this, but I'll let you guys go first if you have any ideas about what type of game might fit into this perspective world type.
Like Detroit becoming human, that one.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I kind of forget exactly, but let's look it up and explain what you mean.
It's like every step you have to at the beginning you have to play a role as a detective, and every step you choose actually affect the plot. So basically, you based on your choice, you create another world.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's pretty. This one is a complicated example, but I think it is a good one. I think that makes sense. Any other ideas, games that fit into the perspective world example?
Would what It Takes Two count, where they get turned into like puppets?
Yeah, that's a good example.
Like the main couple turned into like voodoo doll puppet things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. That's similar to one of the examples I was going to use. Yeah. Other examples? All right. I'm just gonna close the door. Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So, one of the classic examples of a perspective world from literature is Rip Van Winkle. Do you guys remember that story at all? You might have read it like in high school or something. But the idea behind Rip Van Winkle is that this guy falls asleep for 20 years and then he wakes up and goes back to town and sees how everything has changed. So that's an example of a perspective world where one character experiences this change and that leads them to see the world in a different way. So the examples you guys gave are really good examples as well. The one that I like to do is Octodad. I think that's a really good one. If you guys have ever played that game, you are an octopus pretending to be a human. And so, your physics and the way that you behave, your behaviors are different, but you're trying to make them seem like you're a human. So you're interacting with the human world from this different perspective, from the perspective of an octopus. So that's a little bit more of a specific, like there's, the kind of like narrative is built into the setting. So those are some good examples. Our world is pretty obvious. It's a recreation of the real world, or the world that we experience. Should be easy. Any examples of our world, games set in our world?
Probably like Call of Duty or those sort of like games.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly set in our world.
Yeah, games that have like a high level of realism and are based on history or modern current events. Other examples?
How about Skyline? The construction, the game is going to access to construct the city. Skyline, that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. A lot of simulation style games like The Sims and stuff like that. That's a good one. All right, let's keep going. Okay, sci-fi. So sci-fi and fantasy kind of overlap a bit, and a lot of times you see them at the same time. What makes sci-fi, if you had to think about it, what makes sci-fi different from fantasy, or what do you think might be the difference?
Some kind of scientific premise that is exaggerated and modified for the sake of the story arc.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good example. That's a good explanation. So any examples of games that are sci-fi rather than fantasy?
Cyberpunk 2077.
Mm-hmm.
Dead Space.
Mm-hmm.
Mass Effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, those are all good ones. So it's just technology, basically. It's like some sort of scientific advancement, and so the world is recreated around something that's not magic, even though it's not real necessarily. It's not based on magic, or which is typically like fantasy doesn't really have to have like an explanation for why magic exists. It could have an explanation, but it doesn't have to. With sci-fi, there's some scientific explanation, and sometimes it's more detailed or more realistic. Sometimes it's not, but there's some scientific, technological change that makes the world different from the world that we live in.
Professor, sorry, I do have a question.
Yeah.
How about Spider-Man? Is that a sci-fi? Spider-Man.
Yeah. So I guess Spider-Man is fantasy. But I think it involves sci-fi elements because that's a good question. So in Spider-Man, he gets bit by a radioactive spider. So the spider is radioactive because of science, right? Because of like, I don't know, whatever, nuclear fission or something like that. So that's a good question, actually. I guess that kind of is like on the fence because the relationship to science is pretty loose. But it is scientifically based, I guess, the premise for that. And then there's a lot of like, I'm trying to remember, I guess like Iron Man is a lot of technology, and sometimes they're in the same zone. But Spider-Man, well, he does have some, I guess it depends on like which part of the like, Spider-Man era or whatever comic book you're reading, because sometimes he has more tech related stuff, and sometimes there's more sort of fantasy related stuff, like what's the character that's like he's like a what's that Spider-Man character? I guess this is not really that relevant, but who's the one that's like I should know this. I don't know why I can't remember this. Oh, Venom. Spider-Man, Venom.
Venom.
That's like more fantasy, right? Like he's like he's like part of like a suit that's like some biological.
A living armor,
he's like
basically.
an alien.
Yeah. So that's kind of more fantasy, but maybe it's sci-fi. I don't know. It's a good question. It's kind of in the middle.
It's, I guess, more sci-fi since they call themselves aliens. Like,
Okay. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
yield to like aliens.
Okay. Fair enough. All right, let's keep going. So the next one is historical or period. So that's again pretty straightforward. And again, there's a lot of like crossover. But what's a good example of a historical or period setting for a game?
A Ghost of Tsushima, it could be.
Could be. I don't know that one, but let's. What's the setting for that? What is it?
It's like in ancient Japan, I believe.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Oregon Trail.
Oregon Trail. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, Oregon Trail, that one.
Yeah.
Get dysentery.
Okay, yeah, first invasion of Japan. So that's based on a historical event. So that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, anything that involves, a historical moment or historical event, and then turning that into part of the narrative or the setting for the game. Mythological. So this is, again, it could involve some fantasy, it could involve some historical, but mythological is a little bit different. So what makes mythological different, and what are some examples of some mythological settings for games?
God of War.
Mm-hmm.
God of War kind of uses mythological stories like Greek mythology or Norse mythology. It's like a reference to kind of build the world and all like the sort of characters in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I think something that includes like things relating to stuff like gods and mythological creatures and stuff and battling them.
Yeah.
I think would count into that territory.
Fantasy that was once taken as fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, so like things. So wait, would the Loch Ness monster be like mythological?
Yeah, I think so.
Because like some people still believe it.
Yeah.
It's like a
Depends on the belief.
cryptozoological.
Yeah, but say
but
like,
it's
or
still
would
pretty
cryptids
much-
count as mythological things?
I
Yeah.
think so. Kind of.
Yeah, I think so. It's a myth. Yeah, that's kind of what makes it different. It involves fantasy, or it could involve historical, but it's based on myths, and myths are stories that are explain the origin of something, or come from a literary tradition. Like there's
Folktale?
yeah, there's different sort of like ways to define it, but I think those are all valid. But it has to borrow. So you can't make up your own mythology, right? Like you can say this is the mythology of this game or whatever, but a mythological game is borrowing from an existing mythology. So whether it's the Norse gods or the Greek gods or Loch Ness Monster, like any of those myths could be the basis for a mythological setting. And a lot of what we'll talk about this more with genre, but a lot of this is like references. Like we see a reference and it gives us it reminds us of things that we've seen before, or it's in some cases you might know a ton about a certain history or certain mythology, and that kind of establishes framing and expectations that we can use in the game to create gameplay and onboarding or interactions with the user. So then fictional world. So this one is a little, I put a comment in there because it's a little harder to understand, but basically this is like taking an existing fictional universe. So like making a video game out of Star Trek. So this is not just creating the fiction, but actually making a game based on a fictional world that already exists. So if you're going to make, the Spider-Man game would be an example of that. Taking an existing fictional franchise or story or movie or something like that and creating a game world based out of it. Cool. So those are some good examples. Let's keep going. So here's the Star Trek arcade game. So using that fictional world as a setting, a lot of it, you can see the setting is built into the console as well as the game itself. So more things to consider with our setting in our game. the physical dimensions of the game. So once we choose a type of world, that is going to change what the physical dimensions might be. So if you have a game set in space, you have a lot more space that you have to work with and design. If your game is set in like, a room, then you don't have as much space to work with. And so the physical dimensions change. 2D versus 3D. This has to do with more of like our work setup, but we can think about this in terms of the setting, how space works in a 2D world versus a 3D world. Boundaries. We need to define the boundaries in our game. So in some games like Tetris, you can see the entire game world, or Pac-Man, you can see the entire game world in one screen. You can see, the top, bottom, right, left, and, everything that goes into it. In other games, you can't see the whole game world. So you have to define boundaries. So, there's like, you guys have probably seen videos of people like trying to get to the edge of different games that have really big open world spaces and stuff like that to find where the edge is. So we need to set the boundaries. And that's something that we can think about when we're designing levels, but also just when we're designing a space. Like if we're designing a big open space, then we have to think about like putting mountains or trees or other things to, kind of give us a sense of where the space either continues or ends, but our player can't continue through. So that's another thing that we think about with our setting. The scale of things. So in realistic games like The Sims, we're going to try to make the player or the characters, the relative size to the buildings and the streets and other things like that, other objects in the game. In a fantasy type game, we might not care as much about the realism of the scale of things. We might want to change the scale to kind of enhance the dynamics of the game or the experience of the game. I use Katamari Damacy as a good example of that. If you guys have ever played this, there's a Sims with our realistic, and here's Katamari where we're this growing huge ball. So we're growing out of proportion and scale to the rest of the world.
Great game.
Yeah, so it's a good one. It's fun. So some of the elements, and this is like, just kind of like thinking about what do we put in the game. And so sometimes you just know, it's like, okay, I want some clouds, I want some trees or whatever. But it's good to think through, like, if I have a scene, what are all the different things that could be in it, all of the non-interactive things, and how many of those things do I actually need to communicate the idea of the setting? So if I'm making a game that's set, in a house, I need, some couches and some chairs and some lights and stuff like that. Like if I'm making this scene in The Sims, but I can't recreate everything in the house. Like that would take too much time. I'm not going to have like, discarded like napkins on the floor and old magazines and stuff like that. Or, depending on the level of detail, you might want to include those things. But, we have limitations, even though we can put a lot more in our games than we used to be able to. There's still limitations. So we can't put everything that exists in a scene into our game. So we have to choose things to communicate the setting. So a few kind of basic categories that we can think about are the terrain. This is just like, is the land flat? Are there mountains? Are there rivers? Things like that. Or are we in space or underwater? Physical rules like gravity, we have to add those into the setting. And then flora and fauna are trees and plants and stuff like that, as well as animals and other things that are in the game. And then cultural artifacts is, anything that is man-made. So, if discarded magazines or, a sculpture or a painting, things like that add to the setting of where we are. We also need to think about screen space and communicating, a virtual space to the actual physical dimensions of the screen. We have this like pretty basic 2D plane that we have to work with. And so we have to keep that in mind in order to imply the boundaries, the dimensionality of our space. We can use the background in the foreground. We can use vertical space, and we can use horizontal space. So we really don't have that much to work with, but within that, we can kind of imply a lot. Another aspect of the setting that, we don't think of as visual, but it can be implied with visuals and other things is the time. Does time behave in our game like it does in real world? Is time slowed down? Is time sped up? Can the user control time? These are all things that would influence the setting. Typically, our time is going to just move forward at a constant rate. If I jump, I'm going to go up and then I'm going to fall. But there's a lot of games where you can manipulate time. Things like Super Hot, where you can, change the speed of the game based on your movement and stuff like that. That's another component of the setting. So then back to kind of finding inspiration. There's a lot of different ways you can find inspiration for this, like looking at other games, looking at movies, looking at art, going to an aquarium or a garden, looking at how people design spaces, and then thinking about what are they telling us with these different elements of the setting. I have a bunch of links here to things that I like to look at. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to look at them. Things like aquariums, which is where that first image comes from. You can see all these like different kind of cool aquariums. Like I like this iPod one, it's like using framing and, using the space to kind of set different scenes. And you can see what's being used to communicate. Like there's very few elements that are being used to communicate a concept or an idea. So that's a good place to find inspiration. Garden landscapes. This is a YouTube video. I'm not going to play through the whole thing, obviously, but one of the things that gardens do really well.
I wonder how the pros create those.
Is whoops. Oh, why did I? Using color and balance. So gardens do a good job of leading somebody through a space. So usually a garden has different colors, and they also have what's called a feature. So a feature usually draws somebody. It could be like a fountain or a big sculpture. And usually people are drawn towards the feature, but then you also design the garden to move people around the feature or other components of the garden. So I find these videos are actually really inspiring because they talk about these different elements and kind of go through how they work and how to think about them. So yeah, choosing a focal point, that's another term for it. So in games, we really have to do that a lot. We have to think about how do we get somebody to move from one side of the screen to the next. Landscape design is another good one. This has a bunch of different rules. Some cool terrariums. Aquascaping. This is just more aquarium and fish tank type stuff. But there's a lot of, this is just like one example, but there's a lot of different places where you can find inspiration as far as how to design a space. Like how do I lead somebody through a space? How do I balance color using repetition? All these different things will help you think about how do I set up my scene to create the setting that I want to kind of communicate to my user. All right, so that's it for our setting. So I'm going to stop the recording.